So, welcome again to the Lutheran History Podcast, where we cover over 500 years of Lutheranism. We hear news stories, examine old heroes of faith, and dig into the who, how, what, and why of history making. So, whether you are a Lutheran seeking to understand your faith's rich roots, a history lover, or a person looking for stories of trials, tragedies, and triumphs, you will find what you're looking for right here. Our guest speaker for today is Pastor Justin Dauk, a native of northeastern Wisconsin, a 2011 graduate of Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary, and he spent several years as a pastor in north-central South Dakota, and that is the focus for today's topic. Right now, he is recently took a call to Beatrice, Nebraska, so he's no longer in the region, but the topic for today is the history of the Wisconsin Synod's Dakota-Montana district. Also point out that Pastor Dauk also serves on the board for the WELS Historical Institute. Pastor Dauk, thank you so much for joining us today. We had a hard time recording last time due to Alaskan internet stability issues, but we're happy to try again today.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
So just a general question of, as we look at the history of the United States, we see a general pattern of westward movement, and as people immigrate and emigrate, they sometimes bring their church and religion with them, sometimes they don't. But what brought the Lutheran Church to the Dakotas and Montana?
It really starts, southwestern Minnesota. The Minnesota Synod at that time organized like 1860, so about 10 years after the Wisconsin Synod, and pastors start going out from there. They kind of do the start in St. Paul where it began and keep going out, and pretty soon they're getting down to southwestern Minnesota. And what the Homestead Act of 1862 brings this influx of people, and there's a lot of German immigrants. And so from very early on, the conventions of the Minnesota Synod, they're making mention of, we got to get these new settlers. And of course it says in the West. And I know the episode that in your paper that you recently wrote, the Lutheran Synod of the West, you said it's not exactly what we would think of as West today, but for the Minnesota Synod, that what is today the border of Minnesota and South Dakota is the West. And so that's where they're going. That's where they feel we need to be serving these people.
Yeah, and I just find this interesting for our American Lutheran history talks is not that we don't have a mission field before us today, but in some ways, to oversimplify it, in the 19th century, it was almost go west, right? That's where the population's going. Pretty obvious where we're going to start new congregations will be where there are new population centers popping up, and that seems to follow the general pattern from what your research has found, what you presented in your book. Now, you mentioned the Minnesota Synod served these early Lutherans. Do you have any particular anecdotes about an individual or two that pop out to you?
Yeah, I think the one that you start with, there's a guy, I think they had an early guy that came from, I forget which seminary now, but he accepted the call, and they found out very early. And it says in the minutes of the Minnesota Synod, he's now in league with the Unionists, and that's a translation, obviously, out of the German. But I think he ends up going like Iowa Synod or something like that. And so Hunziker is the first one. He kind of gets it rolling, and then there's this guy, Christoph Becher, that really is, they say, the father of the Eastern Conference of the Dakota-Montana district. So that's like your Watertown, South Dakota, where the high school is there now. Brookings, where the SDSU, South Dakota State University, Sioux Falls, all those. And he didn't start all of those, but really the early congregations is really, it's Christoph Becher. And he's going to serve these people. There is one that I found that said when he would get there, so he goes out and his travels are about 6 weeks. He's got to travel for about 6 weeks to get to all his stations. And as he gets to a place, it's Tuesday night, let's say, And so I think it was Grover, South Dakota. They said he'd go to Grandma Fritz's, is what the one history book said. And Grandma Fritz would send her boys out, or grandsons, whatever it may be, to as far as they could ride. And they'd say, the pastor's here, church is tomorrow. So church was then on Wednesday that time. And the next time you might get there on Friday, and it'd be on Saturday. But that's kind of the way it went. They're living in these little claim shacks. I mean, this is the time of, like, if anybody's ever read Little House on the Prairie, and what is it? The Long Winter. This is Betcher living 80 miles away from where you hear the stuff going on for that family. So he's going and he's trying to serve all these people spread out far and wide, and in kind of having to kind of keep up, or what do you want to say? Try and keep the people from falling prey to kind of some of the more reformed preachers that were happy to get whoever they could, and were happy to act like Lutherans, tell people they're Lutherans, if it meant, getting to, I don't know if it was like marking them down as a statistic of people they served. But so that was definitely a challenge, and Betcher faced that a lot. So.
Yeah, in my own research, which overlaps maybe not the same time or geography, but just that Reise Prediger topic, a lot of those other pastors were driven, like you said, by statistics. They had to give, they were financially supported sometimes by mission societies, and they gave the report. And much, pastors do this today too, but how many baptisms, how many confirmations. But another column that really popped out was how many conversions did you have? And I think that's a lot of more of the Methodist approach as well, to get into that. Yeah, so there's some tough competition, and that was something in my research on Friedrich Wyneken that I found too, that the Methodists were fine with saying, Luther would agree with us. We're basically more developed Lutherans, so you might as well join us anyway. So do you want to talk more about this concept of a Reise Prediger? You bring it up in your paper, and I guess the translation of it would be like a traveling preacher is the way I usually see it as.
Yeah, I think in there I'm mostly stuck with the German, and that kind of followed former Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary professor Westerhouse, who had written an article in the WELS Historical Institute journal years ago, and he kind of had an aversion to using circuit rider, because that was the Methodists and others who kind of, they were like, some of the things you said, they had less training. They were young guys sending out, going, okay, just go do what you can. And on the other hand, the Reise Prediger, that was the mission board basically of nowadays. And they were, obviously well-trained men who went out and I feel like, looking at that, they definitely sacrificed for the sake of the gospel. And it was a rough life. It was tough. But they would go out and they would do those travels. They would, part of their pay was usually a couple horses and a buggy sort of thing. That Christoph Betcher I mentioned, he'd talk about it very much. He'd say, we gotta get them with word. We gotta get out there with word and sacrament, because otherwise these circuit riders are going to get them to fall away from the truth. And even he would get to places, and people would be very suspicious when he'd say, whether it was the term confessional Lutheran, I'm a confessional Lutheran pastor. And they would go, yeah, but that guy who visited us 2 weeks ago said that too. And you look at some of the things from him, like I mentioned, it was striking to me as I was reading my kids the Long Winter that I mentioned earlier, and kind of like, wow, this is the exact same winter that they mentioned with him. They would have to go and collect straw to burn, and that was all they had. Wow. That winter, and not only him and his family that he's trying to take care of, they were boarding on this like homestead claim. They're boarding students from the church that he's basically the school teacher. He's giving them catechism instruction, and like they're taking care of way more than even their family. And so at one point his buggy breaks down, and he says to the Minnesota Synod convention, he says, I don't have the money to buy it myself. I've only been able to visit my areas twice since the last convention. And ultimately, after many years of faithful service, Christoph Becher, he ends up he kind of says, I think I need to move on. He says, my faithful horse has sore feet, was his quote, as he kind of, not really, it's different than resigning from the ministry, what we'd say today, but kind of I don't think I can do this anymore, some health things. And that was, he was a guy that just was kind of the guy in the eastern part of South Dakota there, I think we'd point to. So.
Yeah, and I've seen that pattern before. Those Reisepredigers, they kind of, I don't know if that was like a Germanic sense of duty, or that's just the way, life was tougher back then, but they kind of tended to work until they dropped, or at least they just physically couldn't do it anymore. Now, I'm just kind of curious what you found in the stuff you looked at. Now, with the Reiseprediger, like you mentioned, for example, might be preaching a Sunday service on a Wednesday or a Friday, just depending on the schedule. Did that mean that the nature of the work of a Reiseprediger differed significantly from that of maybe a parish pastor? It seems like maybe they were boiling down their work to, I'm traveling a lot, and then I'm going to preach, teach catechism, and then move on. Is that kind of their ministry workload? Was it a little bit maybe less than that administrative sick visit kind of stuff? Was that kind of cut out of it?
Yeah, I think there's only so much they probably could do as far as, shut in or like a, sick visit or hospital visit that we might make. And I think, just so much of their time on the road, certainly there were those aspects, and, he makes those rounds every 6 weeks, and maybe it's more in winter, but, he's teaching the children from the church for so long. So definitely there are those aspects of it. Later on, we hear of, that they would have the pastor go somewhere else, kind of in a regional area. Like he lived in near Minnesota, but he'd maybe go over into eastern South Dakota, and then they would have a bunch of the churches, the kids from the different congregations come to him somewhere, and then each family was responsible for hosting him. I forget if it was like 2 nights per child. And so like that was kind of their, they feed him, they lodge him, and all these different things. So I think there were aspects of it, but probably not the way we think of today, maybe more chunks of time.
Yeah. Maybe the grass is always greener, but it would be like, hey, it would be kind of nice if I could just, preach and teach, and that's all I had to do. But then again, you almost died traveling to where you're preaching sometimes with the weather. Yeah, I don't know if that's a fair trade-off. Yeah. But just a slightly different work, I guess, is the conclusion I'm taking from this, that you don't exactly equate a pastor today with a pastor back then, different challenges and opportunities. I just find this fascinating. So, but I'm going to move on because you have a lot of other things in your book that you came up with. So you mentioned part of the population got a nice little population boost in the area, but it also had some unique challenges with that too. So in what way were the newly arrived German Russian immigrants both a challenge and a blessing for those in the district?
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I think once I made the mistake of saying Russian Germans, and I was corrected German Russians, and that's they're people. They're ethnically German, but in like 1763, it was Catherine the Great of Russia puts out this. They call it this excellent piece of propaganda. She needed people in these like lowly populated, not very densely populated areas. She needed infrastructure. She needed industrialization sort of stuff, and so she ends up inviting all these Germans, because she's German, and gets them to come over with all these grand promises. And over, the next 100 years or so, the promises slowly get whittled away. And it was promises of religious freedom. This is after the 30 Years' War. So it's the Germans are very happy to go and get out of there. It's a really bad way in their homeland. But what ends up happening then is one of these Germans, so Germans from Russia is another way of putting it. They're influenced very heavily by pietism, like so many others. They're influenced by Eastern Orthodoxy, but they end up finally this decree goes out and basically completely cuts off all the promises she made for religious freedom, all these different things. And so what happens? These German people need to move again. And so they come to America. They find the East heavily populated, but there's this Homestead Act here in the late 1800s, and they start moving into what is kind of central South Dakota, central North Dakota, all the way down here where I am now. The headquarters for the Germans from Russia societies in Lincoln, Nebraska. So it kind of runs down the center of our country in a lot of ways. And when they get there, what do they expect? Well, they expect one of the challenges is like one pastor talks about he had been gathering with these people for a number of months, and they decide, oh, maybe we should organize a congregation. And in the process of this meeting of organizing a congregation, they inform him he's been dismissed as their pastor because he read his prayers out of a book. They wanted ex corde prayers, and that was it. And there's those elements of some of the pietistic things in there. Another story that I heard numerous times was they're meeting in a schoolhouse, and the pastor's talking, and he sets his book on the desk. He's up at the teacher's desk, and he walks around to the front, and I don't know that he actually even sat on it, but he sat at the front of the desk where the Bible was behind him. And by the end of the service, he was informed that he was no longer wanted there because they didn't want a pastor who would sit on his Bible and things like that. And so it's an interesting group. They have some very there's some quirks that come along with their Germanness, and then also that the Russian part that's in there, but a really a neat history. And you can go really the difference in when they immigrated. There's so much. So those early German Russian immigrants were the ones in North Dakota and South Dakota. You get a little later on, and we hear it. And I talked with our professor Deutschlander. I don't know if you ever had him or knew him. He was retired by about the time I got to Martin Luther College. And he talked about when he was in Canada, he was serving German Russians that came over after the Bolshevik Revolution. And so he just had these fascinating stories, and it really goes along. Many of them equated German language with doctrine, and that you were truly Lutheran, because in Russia, their ancestors were starting to be forced to give up their German, and it meant giving up their religion. And then they would find that over here. And so just some big struggles with that, and our work in Canada then with the German Russians that came over later. So.
Yeah, that's interesting. They kind of had to double down twice on their religious ethnic identity. And I think identity is such a huge core concept that we talk about when it comes to the history of the Lutheran Church. Like, what is your Lutheran identity? And sometimes the Germanness goes hand in hand with doctrine. Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, I didn't ever meet, to my knowledge, the famed sainted Professor Deutschlander, which is, I'm just sorry, that's just an awesome name for for any Lutheran history topic. But I did know, and he's still around, Pastor Wally Lesher in Manitowoc. He was born in Germany, and because of his native German skills, he was called to serve that I think that same population, or at least a similar group of them. So yeah, definitely holding on to that. Yeah, for a while. Now I'm going a little off topic, but I like little anecdotes like this. My wife's family, some of them were German Russians, and I think modern day Moldova, but back in the Russian Empire. So they left at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution as well. And during the Red Scares, during the 1920s and 1950s, they would say, oh yeah, we're German immigrants. But during World War II, well, we're Russian immigrants. And they would just change what they told other people based on international politics at the time. So definitely a blend of those identities too. Interesting.
Yeah. And yeah, that's if there's one I think with that I had in there. I think it's an interesting kind of blend of that. And Pastor Lesher, yeah, he served our first congregation, our first Wisconsin synod, then congregation up in Canada, and kind of that was the whole. They wanted a German speaker. That was kind of their main thing. And when he took a call elsewhere, then Pastor Deutschlander served as a vacancy those congregations, but he served one up in Barrhead, and that was Barrhead, Alberta. And he told the story of, he said, they didn't share a lot of stories from the old country. It was just too painful. But he said, first, that he did get one story out of it. And they said, first, the Germans came through, and we hid in the church basement. This was during, this would have been, during the wars and things. And he said, we hid in the church basement, and the Germans came through, and we said, we're German, ethnic Germans. And so they only shot some of us when they found us. And then he said, about 2 weeks later, the Tsar's army came through. So this had been World War I. The Tsar's army came through, and we hid in the church basement, and they found us, and they bring us out and lined us up to shoot us. And we said, we're Russian citizens. And Pastor Deutschlander said, well, and they were. And so they said they only shot some of us. And then, weeks later, the Bolsheviks come through, and they hide in the church basement, and they find, they said, we're loyal to the Tsar, the Tsar's army. And then when the Bolsheviks come through, they said we're Russian citizens. And so they only shot some of us. And he said that was the trauma of, the people that came over after that. And yeah, he said, it's hard to understand, if you haven't lived that. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And Pastor Lesher probably could have emphasized a little bit with them. He was just a kid at the time, but he told me the story of he and his siblings were excited one day because they found an artillery shell had exploded in their backyard, and they thought that was the coolest thing. That was during World War II, though, growing up. So, sure. But he had to immigrate when the communists took over East Germany. And yeah, that's a whole nother story, which there is a series of articles in the WELS Historical Institute journal talking about the Lesher family. So if people are interested in that, but yeah, I think that made him maybe a natural choice to work with them. And yeah, like I said, another whole topic there. I think I got a little ahead of ourselves here. How did the Dakota-Montana region, it is originally part of the Minnesota Synod, correct?
Yep.
How did it become its own district? When and why did that happen?
Well, so that's when the Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Nebraska synods had been in a federation, like kind of they're independent, but they're working together. And then when they finally, in 1917, they joined together, and they become the one synod, which was the joint synod of Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and other states, I believe it was. And so at that time, then this change allows, I think Professor Frederick, in his book, The Wisconsin Lutheran, says it allowed a couple remote areas to become their own districts. And so that would have been in the year 1920. So 3 years after now the Minnesota Synod is the Minnesota District. They get together in Mankato, Minnesota, and they basically, with the blessing of the Minnesota District, they vote the Dakota-Montana District into being. And there's a number of reasons, just kind of length of travel. You have people who live out in those areas that we talked about, whether it's eastern South Dakota, where Pastor Betcher was, as you get further towards the Missouri River and the German Russians, and even to the western side of the state, they just, I would say they get the work a little bit more. They understand it when you have those guys on your mission board rather than, so far away over in the Twin Cities or New Ulm or Mankato, places like that. So there was distance. There was, a lot of those things that came along with the reasoning of a new district to the west.
So around that same time, we have the big event of the early 20th century, World War I, very far away, you would think, geographically speaking, from Dakota, Montana. You're about the safest you could be from World War I. Yet it had a pretty big impact. How did World War I affect things in the district?
Yeah, so that's, you kind of go, kind of maybe the bigger picture. The Wisconsin Synod, I think, was even more entrenched still in the German as a whole than, like, say, the Missouri Synod, who's bigger and kind of expanding more into more areas. But and then you'd go, well, the Dakota-Montana district even more so, because you do have those back to the German-Russian ideas, of we need to hold on to this language. Language equaled religion. Steve Gergel, who is, I believe, serving one of our high schools in the Twin Cities now, he was out in our district for a while. He had wrote a paper, "The War to End All Germans," and I found that very useful and helpful, in some of the research he did, it was basically all these ethnic Germans who only spoke German pretty much were very much persecuted. In Elkton, South Dakota, the day after the U.S. declared war on Germany, all of the German language textbooks from the public school were dumped into the outhouse of our church in Elkton, South Dakota. You couldn't use German. One pastor wrote about how it was the son of the pastor wrote when his dad announced that he could no longer preach in German for services, these old Germans crying in the pews and wondering what was going to happen. Again, I think that goes back to that language equals doctrine. The language equals, what's being taught. And so Elkton, the congregation there, it's in the eastern side of South Dakota, they end up meeting across the border at somebody's farm in Minnesota. And you have these kind of citizen watchdogs, the American League, I think, or something like that it was called, who are, trying to get the government to come in and bust them and kick them out and things. In Roscoe, South Dakota, where I served, I found the Ladies' Aid disbanded for like 5 or 6 years because you couldn't have meetings in German. And they got special permission for a German confirmation service in 1918. So South Dakota passed some of the most strict laws. North Dakota had some that were tough. Minnesota had some that were tough. But South Dakota, the government there definitely made it very difficult on our churches.
Yeah, and I think it was in those states where they had, I think the Dakotas were some of them where they were majority either German born or of German ancestry. They probably freaked out a bit, like, we got to clamp down on this, this perceived threat, even more so than other areas. That I forgot what I was going to say, but yeah, that definitely is something that pops up throughout any Lutheran synod's history in the United States, especially the German ones. I think we could just leave it there because you mentioned Steve Gergel's paper. He's our next episode, actually. So after
okay.
we'll talk about the war to end all Germans, but those are very interesting anecdotes for sure. Really shook things up pretty much in every level. Now, can you tell us a little bit about the Christian education that took place within the district? It's always been part of Lutheran heritage, and especially the Wisconsin Synod has always had a big focus on Christian education. So what did it look like in Dakota, Montana?
Sure. Yeah. So early on, like 60 to 70% of the congregations are mission congregations, meaning they're getting some kind of funding assistance from the Synod, from the church bodies. So part of the reason, so there again, the Dakota, Montana ends up behind much of WELS as far as in schools. And that had to do with the language thing too, because in other parts of the Synod, from the research I did there, the schools end up driving the switch to English because the kids are learning English in school and things like that. But out there, so we're a mission district. So over half the congregations getting that subsidy. Mission boards don't really want to fund a school too. And so what happens is, as soon as they can figure out a way for 4 or 5 congregations to band together to be able to support a pastor without mission funding, that means we can go do more mission work. And so schools generally aren't part of that equation early on. The first 2 district conventions in the Dakota, Montana district, so that would have been 22 and 24, they had professors from our, I think one was from Dr. Martin Luther College, one was probably from the seminary, I think, in would have been Milwaukee at that time. And both of them were about, we need Christian education. And the district president kind of scolds them, says, we need more schools, we need schools. And then the response was, yes, we regret we don't have more schools, but that's kind of as far as it went. One school was in Elgin, North Dakota. That was sounds like funded by one family. It started out pretty good, but it closed in about 2 years because the enrollment and then probably the funding, since it was funded in that way. What really ends up happening, and probably is the boost, is there was the push in the 1920s, and the Musa report, which was it Hans Musa, he wrote in Northwestern Lutheran a lot, and he was kind of the head of that commission. They suggest we should have basically prep schools. I think it's in every conference or at least in every district. And the Dakota-Montana district ends up being the beneficiaries of that right away. And in 1927, it's passed that the synod is going to open a prep school. It ends up being the Academy, Northwestern Lutheran Academy in Mobridge, kind of right in the central part of South Dakota there.
So in previous episodes, especially the one with Dr. Mark Brown, we talked about the split between the Wisconsin Synod and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And that comes up as a regular theme on this show when we talk about that time period. Again, though, I think it helps us to kind of have a grassroots view of it, or boots on the ground, whatever cliche you want to use. But what did that look like? How did that play out again in the Dakota-Montana district? I think there's some pretty significant stories that I don't think quite made it into the book.
Yeah, I think there's the history between the church bodies. The Missouri Synod was actually in that area, in the Dakota territory at that time, before the Minnesota Synod got there. So there's this agreement between Missouri and Wisconsin. The Wisconsin Synod is going to take the rural areas, the small towns. Missouri's in places like Sioux Falls, and we were in Watertown early on, but like some other areas like Rapid City once you get out to the Black Hills and that. So there is this tension as things began to point in the direction of kind of the synodical conference falling apart, I guess, for lack of a better term, that Dr. Brown was on and talked about. They start going, well, we need to be in these cities because we're transferring members to the Missouri Synod congregations there. And suddenly it doesn't look like we're going to be able to do that anymore. And so you have it's interesting, some of the stories, the split between the LCMS and the Wisconsin Synod was a very big topic for the Wisconsin Synod guys, because of some who were very, I'm going to say, amped up about it. And the Missouri guys, it says that they would go to these mixed conferences, like one up in North Dakota, and they're talking about these things that are happening, and the Missouri guys are going, what do you mean? What do you mean there's this, not seeing eye to eye? And so it seems like maybe there were some, I'll maybe say itching to leave, itching to kind of get going on breaking fellowship. And then when it didn't happen soon enough, in the Dakota-Montana district, that was a very big topic, was those that broke away from the Wisconsin Synod because of how they viewed we weren't breaking soon enough with Missouri. And Mark Brown kind of in that paper, I think you guys talked about, those were trying times, I think was his one paper. And he really, there's some from the Dakota-Montana district there that really touch on that. And the difficulties that were going on up there. So,
yeah. So I know when I did a little history on the Pacific Northwest district, it was like, I think there's almost like a quarter of the entire district left, like in the 1950s. And I just found that interesting that it seemed to be more in those outlying districts, apart from maybe the more central Midwest, where people took that a bit more seriously and said, this is, it's kind of an all or nothing deal. I wonder if that had something to do with being a little more isolated or self-sufficient, that they weren't afraid to make that break, where other people maybe, felt a little more closer to the institutions that they wanted to hold on to. That's just a little theory I had just looking at that. Now, you mentioned, and this is something, again, that Mark Brown brought up too, that once that split with Missouri happened, he uses this phrase all the time. It's like, you could take the water wings off and you could swim on your own. And that seemed to work out quite well for the Synod at large, and also for the Dakota-Montana district being on their own, that they said, there's more for us to do and the more we can do. So how did the district expand in the latter half of the 20th century?
Sure. Yeah, you have some of the big ones maybe. So Sioux Falls and Aberdeen, I think, are two of the big ones at that time. And in Aberdeen, we simply decided we're going to start a church there. And there was some protesting from the Missouri Synod. This is our territory sort of thing that happened out in the Black Hills. Our pastor from Faith, South Dakota, started serving in Sturgis, and then from there to Rapid City. Sioux Falls is where we intertwine with the Little Norwegian Synod, the ELS today. That was how that happened. Was the ELS had a church in Sioux Falls. They built, I believe, a bigger building, and then they wanted to start a second congregation on the other side. Well, most of the members were WELS members from other places. They were having trouble. I don't know if it was like staffing it, or having a pastor there, maybe funding it. And so they quote sold the building to the Wisconsin Synod or the Dakota Montana Mission Board. And this was still before the break. So there wasn't a whole lot of protest from the Missouri Synod then, because we were simply working with another, sister church body. But our Good Shepherd in Sioux Falls ended up starting that way. And that's one of the bigger congregations in our district down there. And then later on, the other ELS congregation ends up merging with second WELS in there. So we kind of had to get into the cities, and that was a big thing. And it certainly shifted, where I served, Roscoe, South Dakota, today a town of 300 people, there were almost 700 members in that congregation. It was the second biggest in the district. And I don't know that Roscoe was ever bigger than 700 population, probably. But now, our biggest congregations there are going to be Watertown, Rapid City, Aberdeen, I think Bismarck, Sioux Falls, things like that. So it's recognizing we need to get into the cities. And another interesting one later on would be Brookings. And Brookings is one of those that started because of, it was called the collegians. So what we call campus ministry today started with the campus ministry there, starting meeting in a house and then growing into a congregation. One of our retired pastors now from South Dakota was going to school at South Dakota State University in Brookings and was one of the charter members. I think he was like the treasurer or something as a student at SDSU, and then went on to college and seminary and served for many years as a missionary. So kind of these interesting different ways compared to back in the 1800s with the small towns. And then you have, and I mentioned a little bit about getting up into Canada. Our boost up into Canada was the German language thing, but we still have a lasting presence up there now, and in a lot of the bigger cities, but also some in between as well.
So I think that kind of wraps up where doing an overview. You have a whole book on this, so we don't want to spoil the whole thing. I hope people can get a hand on a copy if they want to learn more. Not asking you to be a prophet or anything, but just knowing what's going on in facing the district. What are some unique challenges and opportunities facing the district now and possibly in the future?
I think population is always going to be one. I think the smaller towns, the population, I was told once, that kind of a generation was missing from when farming was really rough in those small towns, and that changed things. Certainly, like I said, the bigger churches are in the big cities now. But at the same time, there's some really great mission opportunities. The oil fields up in North Dakota, we have a church up in Minot that's been going now for a little while. Just got a building here a couple of years ago. Since that Centennial, that history book came out for the district, I think it's Dickinson got mission funding for a new church there because of this core group that had been meeting and watching services online. The pastor would go and serve them once a month with communion in person. And so it's interesting up in, I think, Kalispell, Montana, they're looking at possibly starting a church. Madison, South Dakota, where there's another college town, where mission opportunities are there, even if it doesn't always seem like it. And those are really presenting themselves. We see the Lord's hand in it, and the opportunity to bring the gospel, just like Christoph Becher said in the late 1870s, early 1880s, bring the pure word and sacrament where it's needed.
Yeah, I think that answered my last question. I was going to ask, how will being aware of the past help those concerned with facing these present challenges and taking hold of those opportunities? We as pastors and as Lutherans know, we have something that's more powerful than ourselves, and that's the Word of God, and the sacraments too. Anything else you want to add to that? Just maybe some lessons from the past that can help Lutherans in the future?
No, I think the Centennial was 2020, so it was 1920 that the district started, so that everything got kind of thrown out of whack as far as district convention with COVID and that. But the theme was, "Oh Lord, our help in ages past," and that's of course based on Psalm 90. Lord, you have been our dwelling place, and kind of talking you can see poverty, the Great Depression, and people, the stories where people would go look for their neighbor and they'd find like the table set, like people were sitting down for dinner, and the husband would come home and say, "I lost my job. There's nothing here for us." And they would pack what they could carry and leave with the table still set, and then there was abundance, there was optimism, as I mentioned the academy before, and the Northwestern Lutheran Academy, and just the excitement and the blessing that still is for the district, even though it closed in 1979. The leaders and the people trained, in that Christian education. There's been all these things. There's been all these lessons to learn from, and I hope maybe that's part of it. Tried to get a lot of the stories in there for that Centennial history, and kind of let people see it that way.
Yeah, certainly. I think when we look in the past and see, well, those people went through tough times, I guess we can face tough times today, whether it's demographics, population shifting, or pandemics, or what have you. And the fact that God was with our ancestors, our forefathers, and he can be with us now and for the future. I think that's always an uplifting and essential part of any church history. All right. Well, thank you for sharing some of the content of your book again. Hopefully people, if they're interested, if they have any perhaps roots or connections to that area, might want to get a copy of the book and read some more of the details. Now we switch gears here, talking more about just that history process, because let's face it, I'm a history buff, a history nerd. I like just talking about the process, and anyone who goes through it really has a lot of experiences that they can't put into the paper or into the book. But first I'll ask, how did you get started on this topic and this project?
Yeah, I like history in general. I like Lutheran history. So I did a couple kind of for a 125th anniversary service for both congregations that I served, had their 125th while I was serving there up in South Dakota. And then kind of got asked if I'd be interested in helping something like this on the project. And then it was kind of the other part of that Centennial book is a history, like a one-page history of each congregation. And so it's kind of like, well, who's going to do which one? And they said, well, you wrote those, why don't you do this? And I said, okay, but I need a little help, because I've been here, 6 years, and the gentleman that I was working with had been there like 20 years in the district. So he gave me this outline and helped a lot. I mean, what I tried to do was get stories, and certainly the facts, but not just this, then this, then this, then this, but the stories of people who lived it. And so that's kind of what I ended up doing. And so I probably not really a great structured research sort of procedure. And maybe you can tell I've kind of how my mind was thinking too, as we're talking here today. But I think just there's one semi-retired pastor who's been serving for over 50 years now. He was a big help because I could talk to him. He grew up in the district. He grew up West River, South Dakota, in the town of Faith, and then ended up serving there 40 years later. And then and he's still out there. And so I interviewed him for a while and heard stories from his dad in World War II. And that's kind of how it went. I was really thankful to have that outline, because then I didn't miss anything. They didn't give me how many pages to write or a limit. So it just kind of ended up going where it went with the information I had. So.
Yeah, so it seems like your research method was a lot of interviews. Is that kind of how you approached the research, or what else did you do to prepare for the book?
Yeah, so there were some good histories written in the past. Professor KG Sievert, that was at Northwestern Lutheran Academy for a long time, had written one for the 50th anniversary, 75th anniversary. There were a couple guys that served in the district for a long time that wrote histories. So I was able to use that, but it wasn't just rehashing it. I kind of found some from what they wrote. I could find other things. The internet helps. They didn't have that in '95 really as much to find things. The Synod archives. I know you interviewed the archivist Susan Willems, and she was a huge help finding things for me. Looking at the one former student of the academy in Mobridge has a website listing all the graduates, and so I looked through there, and where there were past listed, I looked up, see how far back there were some still with us, still living, and called them up and said, "Hey, what can you tell me about this?" And just found some really good stuff that way. But yeah, so mostly a lot of interviews, but also other primary sources trying to find too, just like I said, kind of scattered about. So
Yeah, the whole internet age of research, it does it does really help out, and you can find a lot of primary sources online too, and I found that myself. Yeah. Do you have any challenges in conducting your research?
I think there's definitely sore spots for some people. I think you could the Northwestern Lutheran Academy for one, that closing, and that was part of that. I mean, that was huge. That was the center of the district. That's where everything happened, and so that was really tough. And so there's some sore spots, but I don't think there's any bashing. I really don't think there was. People let you know if they didn't agree with how things went, or that split, the split when with what became the Church of the Lutheran Confession, and some of those talking to some people. Pain, it hurts. It's not something that they necessarily like looking back on, but and then also just the fact that there's a lot of things not kept. Oh yeah, we used to have this, but that got thrown out 3 pastors ago, or things like that. And that's, I think, the work of like our archives, or the WELS Historical Institute, the Concordia Historical Institute, things like that is really a blessing. And trying to kind of get people to say, hey, somebody else might want that stuff 50 years from now, so don't just chuck it. So
yeah, well, Susan Willems will really thank you for saying that, because that's kind of the challenge, right? If you throw away a unique original document or something like that, you kind of cause problems for the future of getting that full picture. But yeah, I I understand that church history challenge, because a church history is maybe a little different from other kinds of history, because especially from a pastoral perspective, the goal is always to give glory to God, and to lift up people, and encourage them, motivate them possibly. And at the same time, you don't want to sugarcoat everything either, or cover up actual disagreements or problems of the past. And at the same time, you want to keep the 8th commandment and take people's words and actions in the kindest possible way. So yeah, that's definitely a challenge, especially with the more recent history, which is probably why I like being stuck in the 19th century, where I know I probably won't offend too many people if I present this or that. But yeah, especially that recent stuff, like you mentioned. But yeah, it needs to be recorded. Otherwise, it's just scattered memories and impressions. So finally, for this section, did any discoveries, any finds of your research surprise or excite you in any way?
I think, as someone that likes history and really got to know the people, and especially in the area I was serving, and I think, before I mentioned the German Russians, and certainly wasn't trying to put them down, but when I said, the difficulties of serving, but just kind of, that was, but the stories, that Christoph Becher, some of his descendants wrote a book on him, and it's hard to find now. One of the churches had a copy, but it's in the Concordia Historical Institute papers and things like that. His story is just fascinating. There's another, actually, Missouri guy that started the church I served, Roscoe, South Dakota, coming up, and he had some just fascinating stories of his travels and things like that. I think learning more, and I kind of go back to that, and I know we didn't talk about that a lot now, but the stories of Northwestern Lutheran Academy and just what it meant kind of helped me understand the district more. And it's just kind of like you said, the outlying, it kind of becomes, obviously it's not its own church body, but it becomes, there's unique characteristics and culture. And just the stories, those guys that I mentioned before kind of made me feel like a wimp. I mean, we put a lot of miles on our vehicles out there, but I'm not driving a horse and buggy across a, dirt road, so it really wasn't, bad, but it just kind of puts it into perspective.
Yeah. History has a good humbling effect, a healthy humbling effect, I think, for a lot of us when we get into it. It's like, oh, okay, my problems they're big to me, but maybe in comparison, they're not all that big. All right. Yeah. And I agree. Just doing the research is exciting in and of itself. No argument here. So finally, as we wrap up today's interview, today's episode, do you have any unanswered questions about your own topic? Something you really wanted to get to the bottom of, and you just didn't have the opportunity to find those sources?
I think, I think you had mentioned Pastor Wally Lesher, and I'm hoping I can get a hold of him yet. And I'm kind of working on a part of this for the district or Dakota, Montana District Convention next year. They're kind of doing a redo. And so I'm going to kind of adjust some things, but I want to talk to him because the stuff with those German Russians in Canada came up because somebody passed my draft along to Professor Deutschlander. And then he shared some of those things with me that I was like, oh, this is great. It's one of those things that I never would have figured out if it wouldn't have been that way. So I think digging more into that, and I think just the whole aspect of it, and that could be huge, but I feel like that would be a really interesting topic to dig more into. So,
yeah, cool. I'd find that interesting as well. So you already mentioned that's kind of an area you might want to do some more research on your own topic. Anything else you might see yourself expanding or expounding upon from the research you've already done?
From this, I think probably because I'm not up there anymore. I mean, there's still things that interest me, but probably it's gonna be harder to do. So I think probably what I have here to kind of wrap it up, and for that convention next year, that'll probably be the extent of what I'm able to do. The German Russian thing, I could see working on that in the future, because like I said, it does kind of get down into our area here. So there's some other areas of research, things like that.
Yeah, I've heard of the German-Russian Lutheran connection, especially in the history of our own synod, but that's about it. I heard they exist, it happened, and I don't know anything else about it. So I think that would be an excellent, detailed, focused study. It seems like you have enough on your plate, history speaking, but do you have any other upcoming projects apart from that you're thinking about?
It was just suggested to me from Dr. John Brenner. I was talking to him, and I actually I served for a year in with our mission in Cameroon, and he suggested maybe getting some stories and some kind of remembrances from that. It's been 10 years for me, but how that church started with the Biafran War and our mission work in Nigeria, and how that was how we got into Cameroon too. So I think that might be one that'd be fun to look into. And I know some of the guys that were there in the early days that I could talk to yet and get some of that info. So that might be something in the future.
Yeah. And we haven't really done much of missions talk on this podcast. So I would certainly be interested in that in the future as well. All right. Finally, before we wrap it up today, what in general would you like to see more research and writing done on within Lutheran history from other people?
That's one. That's kind of a tough one. I hear you ask that, and so I kind of know it's coming. But yeah. I think one thing I've enjoyed Mark Brown's LCMS stuff, and I know I think there's going to be more coming with. And I've early on in my life, I have background in the Missouri Synod, so that stuff all interests me. His Tale of Two Synods I bought early on when I saw it and kind of learned more. But I think with the Seminex stuff coming up, it'll be an anniversary coming up for that. I look forward to hearing that. And I really enjoyed your episodes about the ELS too, because I have some Norwegian background but don't know much about Norwegian Lutheranism beyond that. And talk to, his name's escaping me now. Who's on your show? from the ELS. Craig.
Ferkenstedt. Yeah.
Yeah. Or Ferkenstedt. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So his, I thought his stuff was really good. And I kind of want to learn more about that Norwegian Lutheranism. So I guess that's probably maybe stuff that has been done, but maybe what I need to catch up on a little bit.
Yeah, and dig into it. And it's also just encouraging for people who are continuing to work on those other areas to hear that there's an interest for it. So, yeah.
I apologize to Craig because he sent me some info for my project, and his name escaped me there for a second. But
yeah, well, you gave me the deer in the headlights effect too. I'm like, oh shoot, yeah, what was his name? No, I remember now. Yeah, good. Well, we're into the high 20s for episodes now, so I'm thankful to have that problem where we've had so many guests on that I can't instantly remember who everyone was in every episode. But yeah, a lot of ground to cover yet, so I don't think we'll ever run out of material for this show. All right. Well, thank you, Pastor Dauk, for your time today, and we look forward to seeing any future work that you may produce.
Thank you. Look forward to more episodes.
Now, a few of you have asked if there are ways to support this show. One way is to share the show and its episodes. You can do it via some social media. We do have a Facebook page called the Lutheran History Podcast, and that makes it pretty easy to share on that platform. We also have a standalone website at tlhp.buzzsprout.com. You can share that website or a specific episode with pretty much anyone. However, the best way to share the show is probably through word of mouth. So talk about the show. Tell your friends, colleagues, members, or students. Tell them how much you appreciate a certain episode or a speaker.